Summer in the Middle Ages was not a vacation. It was a war of its own, quieter, hotter, sneakier. The mud had dried. The sun now ruled the sky, glaring down like a tax collector with a hangover. Fields shimmered with heat, sweat-soaked tunics before the morning chores were even done. Every breath felt like it cost a coin. But the crops were growing. Barley, wheat, rye. Those green shoots planted in desperation now stood tall and golden, almost ready. Chickens laid again. Goats grazed. Milk was warm and plenty. Bees returned, and their soft hum was a sign of life, of sweetness, of hope. And still, no one rested. Every hand was needed. From sunup to sundown, it was motion, weeding, mending fences, hauling water, repairing carts. Children weren't in school. There were no schools. They were out scaring birds away from fields or helping grind grain. Summer was the brief, brutal sprint toward harvest. Miss it, and winter would kill you next time. But summer didn't just bring sweat. It brought disease. With heat came flies. With flies came filth. And with filth came death. Dysentery, fevers, rotten wounds. The same water you used for drinking might have been used upstream by animals, or worse. Bathing was rare, clean water rarer, and so people died, not of famine, not of frost, but of the very things they'd worked so hard to survive for. Worse still, famine could still strike. A drought, a hailstorm, a freak fire, or locusts, if God was feeling especially Old Testament. All it took was one bad week to turn a good year into another tragedy. The peasants knew this. They didn't expect fairness. They expected work. So they saved. Not money, there was rarely any, but food, tools, small bundles of cloth or salt, anything that might help in leaner days, anything they could barter, fix, or eat. But there was one gift summer gave freely: light, long days, time to work, time to mend, time to teach. Elders would pass down wisdom in the shade. Children would play by the river, splashing in rare moments of laughter. Lovers would meet in haylofts. Stories would be told by firelight. Some old, some new, all necessary, because stories kept you sane. They reminded you that even when the world was harsh, there was still imagination, still hope. And there were moments of celebration too. Midsummer brought bonfires and feasts. Villages gathered for dancing, for bread and ale, for games that were half wrestling, half flirting. People crowned each other with wildflowers and laughed louder than usual, not because life was easy, but because they'd earned that laugh. Every joke was rebellion, every kiss, defiance. Summer, in all its difficulty, was when life felt most alive. But time moves, always, and the days began to shorten. The nights, once warm, began to whisper again. A chill in the wind, a shadow on the sun. Autumn approached, dragging its scythe behind it. Harvest was coming, the most important, exhausting, and dangerous part of the entire year. Because if you didn't get every last grain into the barn before the storms hit, everything you had worked for would rot in the fields. Winter would win before it even arrived. So they sharpened the scythes, called in every hand. worked until backs gave out and fingers bled. Cart after cart of hay, of wheat, of barley, brought in and stored with care and panic. The barns filled, the cellars stocked, and when the last sheaf was tied, when the fields were bare, the people exhaled. Not relief, just pause, because the war wasn't over. Soon the winds would return, the nights would stretch, the earth would harden, and once again the fires would be lit, the cloaks pulled tighter, the food rationed, the same cycle, year after year, cold, mud, heat, harvest, cold again. But that was the secret. The war was never meant to be won. It was meant to be endured. And the real weapon wasn't strength. It wasn't wealth. It wasn't even knowledge. It was stubbornness. Peasants weren't victims. They were survivors. The cold tried to kill them. The heat tried to break them. The lords tried to bleed them. But still they lived, laughed, danced, cursed, planted. And when the snow came again, they didn't tremble. They simply said, "Here we go again," because the eternal war never ends. But neither do its soldiers. Spring, when it finally arrived, wasn't a celebration. It was a reckoning. There was no sudden burst of flowers, no dramatic sunshine and birdsong. It began with mud, endless mud. Roads turned to sludge. Fields became swamps. Snow melted with a groan, and everything beneath it smelled like rot. Months of filth, ash, animal waste, and decay released in a single foul breath. But peasants didn't complain. Mud meant thaw. Thaw meant survival. The dead were buried deeper. The living dragged themselves from winter's grip and did what they always did. They worked. The fields were calling. The tools, rusted and weary from neglect, had to be sharpened. The plough animals, if they survived, had to be fed and yoked. Everything was behind schedule. Spring wasn't a time of relief. It was a sprint. The soil had to be turned. Grain had to be sown. The window for planting was small. Miss it, and you miss the year. And when you're only eating what you grow, that wasn't an option. So even with sore limbs and lingering colds, people pushed forward. Kids helped. Elders advised. No one was idle. And the land, it remembered. Winter had scoured it clean. What little grass had survived was pale and stringy. The trees were cautious, budding slowly. Rain fell like judgment, soaking everything until it clung to your boots and refused to let go. But there was beauty in it too, that first green shoot, that soft bleat of a newborn lamb, that whisper in the wind that maybe, just maybe, the worst was over. But nature wasn't the only thing reawakening. Taxes were due. The Lord's men would arrive, not with swords, but with scrolls and stern expressions, tithes for the church, dues for the manor, a share of grain that hadn't even sprouted yet. There were no excuses. Winter hardships weren't counted in coin. If your barn was empty, your animals thin, your family grieving, too bad. The system didn't care. Pay or suffer. And if you couldn't, you bartered. Chickens, eggs, extra labor. Or you begged. Some lords were merciful, others were not. Then there were debts. Everyone owed someone. Maybe you borrowed seed from a neighbor. Maybe you promised labor in exchange for firewood. Maybe you owed a local merchant for a pot or a patch of cloth. Spring brought out the ledgers, and with them, the tension. Because forgiveness was rare, and interest didn't care how many blizzards you'd endured. Still, amidst the mud and the math, there was life. Babies born during winter, if they survived, were now old enough to gurgle and grab fingers. Young animals stumbled through wet fields. The first herbs pushed through the thawing ground. Wild garlic, nettles, things with flavor. After months of turnips and hard bread, even a bitter green leaf was a feast. And for one glorious moment, people smiled. Not because life was easy, but because they were still here. Spring festivals came, not as grand affairs, but as communal, relief. May Day, Beltane, Easter, depending on the region, the religion, and the ruling power. People danced, not elegantly but fiercely, like they were fighting death with their feet. They drank, they flirted, they told stories around bonfires and remembered that joy still existed, even if it had to be dragged out of the mud. The church reminded them of resurrection. The earth reminded them of renewal. The people reminded each other that survival was worth celebrating, but joy was always temporary. There were mouths to feed, crops to watch, rain to pray for, or sometimes to pray against. Late frosts still lurked like wolves. One bad storm could kill the budding fruit trees. One outbreak of disease, now that people were moving again, could sweep through the village like fire. So yes, spring was beautiful, but it was also dangerous, because it tricked you into thinking the fight was over. The wise peasants knew better. They planted, they patched their roofs, they built up their stores. They welcomed the warmth, but didn't trust it. They remembered the lessons of winter, carried them like scars under their sleeves. And above all, they prepared, because seasons turned, always. And if you let your guard down, if you danced too long, if you forgot how fragile everything was, then summer would punish you, or autumn, or worst of all, another winter. But for now, there was green on the hills, bread in the oven, children playing with sticks in the mud. The cold had lost, for now, and ingenuity had won another round, not through invention, not through comfort, but through persistence, through sheer, stubborn, relentless humanity. That was the real victory. And so, as the days grew longer and the wind softened and the sun felt less like a trick and more like a promise, the people of the village didn't look back. They simply moved forward because they had fields to tend. Winter didn't begin with snow. It began with silence, the kind of silence that settles over a village like a blanket of dread. Birds vanished. The ground froze solid. Even the wind seemed to hush, right before it howled. And then, one morning, the world woke to a white horizon and a hard truth. It had begun. There was no cheering for the first snowfall. No romantic walks or snowball fights. Snow was not a friend. It was a warning. A reminder that the long siege had started, and no one was coming to lift it. The days were short, the nights were endless, darkness fell in the late afternoon, stretching till morning with only candles and hearths to hold it back. Every flame mattered. Every log burned was a calculation. Every minute of warmth was borrowed time. Inside the homes, people layered up, wool over linen, fur over wool. Clothes weren't changed often. They were slept in, worked in, lived in, bathing, a luxury for the rich. For peasants, it was enough to stay dry and avoid frostbite. Hygiene took a back seat to heat retention. You didn't care how you smelled, if your fingers still moved. The hearth became the heart of the home, not metaphorically, literally. It was the only consistent source of heat. People huddled near it, cooked over it, dried their clothes beside it. Children curled up like cats around the embers. Grandparents barely moved from their stools. And still, the cold seeped in, through cracks in the walls, through the floor, through your bones. Sleep wasn't restful, it was tactical. Families slept in shifts to feed the fire. Someone always had to be awake to stoke the coals, to keep death from creeping in quietly. In poorer homes, families piled into one bed, limbs, tangled body heat shared in awkward desperation. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't clean, but it was survival. Food was a slow-burning fear. At first, things seemed manageable. Porridge in the morning, stew at night, a bit of bread if the grain stores hadn't gone mouldy. But by midwinter, the variety vanished. Meals became thinner, beans, turnips, whatever was left. Fat was sacred. It gave energy, kept bodies going. Salt was gold. It kept meat from rotting. Every bite was counted. And yet, despite the planning, the careful preservation, things always went wrong. Mice got into the grain. A barrel of apples rotted unexpectedly. A neighbor came begging because their roof collapsed in a storm. And then someone got sick. Not just a cough, but a deep, rattling sickness that didn't leave. Illness was the great equalizer. It didn't care if your cellar was full. It came for the weak, the old, the unlucky. And there were no doctors. Maybe a village had a healer, a midwife, an old woman who knew herbs. Maybe there was a monk nearby with a tincture and a prayer. But there was no hospital, no antibiotics, no miracle cures. If someone fell ill, you hoped. You prayed. You burned dried thyme and whispered old words. Sometimes it worked. Often it didn't. When someone died, there were no grand funerals, just quick burials in frozen ground. Tears were shed in silence. Grief wasn't shouted, it was swallowed. Because the living still needed to eat, still needed to chop wood, still needed to hold the line. And the cold didn't care if you were mourning. There were moments, around late January, when morale cracked, when people grew quiet and still, not out of peace, but exhaustion, the kind that came from relentless tension, from months of not knowing if you'd make it, from wondering if spring was a myth, a story told to children to keep them from crying. Hope became rationed too. But even then, in the bleakest cold, strange things happened. Moments of humanity sparked like embers in the dark. A neighbor sharing the last of their cheese. Children carving toys from firewood scraps. songs sung softly at night, not to entertain, but to remind one another they were still alive. Because winter didn't just test the body, it tested the soul. You could have all the food in the world, all the firewood, and still lose if your spirit gave out. The cold whispered lies. You won't make it. No one remembers you. Sleep. It's easier. And you had to fight those whispers as fiercely as any storm. Religion became louder in winter. Church bells rang more often, not because of feast days or celebrations, but because people needed to hear something besides the wind. Priests preached fire and brimstone, but also mercy and endurance, the promise of heaven, the hope of a spring beyond death. It didn't matter whether you truly believed. What mattered was the structure, the rhythm, the reminder that time was still moving forward. Then, sometime in late February, a miracle, a bird call, a real one. Not imagined, not a dream. And then a day where the snow softened slightly, where the icicles started to drip, a faint smell of earth in the air. Not warmth, but the possibility of warmth. That's all it took. One sign, and the village would stir. There was no sudden celebration, no festival, but eyes brightened, jokes returned, children dared to play outside again. The cold still held its grip, but it was slipping, losing strength. And just like that, people began to plan again. Spring wasn't here yet, but it was coming, and so they sharpened their tools, counted their seed, cleaned their sheds. The battle wasn't over, but the siege was lifting, and the peasant, weather-beaten, half-starved, but unbroken, stood up and did the one thing that had carried their ancestors through 1,000 winters. They got to work. Autumn was not a gentle farewell. It was a tightening of the grip. A reminder that everything you had done up to this point, every choice, every hour of labor, was about to be judged. The fields stood empty. The trees, once full of promise, began to shed their leaves like tired old men. The sky grew lower, the wind got sharper, and the villagers, those weather-beaten, bone-tired survivors, began to count. They counted sacks of grain, bundles of firewood, jars of preserved fruits. They measured salt, dried herbs, cuts of meat hanging in smokehouses. They ran their fingers over rough linen and checked every thatch, every plank, every crack in the walls, because they knew the cold was coming, and the cold didn't forgive. Miscalculations. You didn't just prepare for winter, you defended against it. Tools were sharpened, roofs patched, root cellars sealed. Livestock was brought closer to home, their pens reinforced, their fodder carefully rationed, every nail driven, every barrel sealed, every door reinforced. It was all part of the last line of defense. And yet, autumn was beautiful, painfully so. The trees turned gold and red. Smoke curled gently from hearths at twilight. The air smelled of apples and wood smoke. It was the season of reflection, a brief, melancholic grace before the siege began. Children played in fallen leaves. Lovers stole moments beneath orange skies. Old men sat by doorways and watched the world go quiet. But no one mistook beauty for safety, because this was also the season of omens. Medieval villagers were not naive. They were not ignorant. But they lived in a world where mystery still ruled, where nature's cruelty needed explanations, and so folklore flourished. A sudden wind from the east, a warning, a crow on your roof, bad luck, a fog that didn't lift by noon, a long, bitter winter ahead. The line between superstition and survival was thin. Charms were hung on doorways, herbs were burned, stories were told around the fire, not just to entertain, but to remember. Last winter, someone would say, old Tom's family ran out of wood by mid-February, had to burn their fence to stay warm. His youngest never made it to spring. Silence would follow, not out of fear, but recognition. No one wanted to be the next story. Autumn was also the time for culling. There wasn't enough feed to keep every animal alive through winter, so choices had to be made. The weakest livestock, those unlikely to survive, were slaughtered. The meat was salted, dried, or smoked. Every part was used, even the bones were boiled for broth. Waste was not just foolish, it was fatal. The killing was done without ceremony. There were no tears, just quiet efficiency. The children watched. They had to. This wasn't cruelty, it was education. The lessons weren't written in books, they were soaked into the rhythm of the seasons, taught in blood and sweat and silence. Sometimes there were fairs before the frost set in, markets where villagers could trade surplus goods, wool, honey, iron tools, for what they lacked. These gatherings were brief, but they were windows into a wider world. News came with the traders, of wars, of famines, of strange omens in distant towns. Some of it was nonsense, some of it was true, but all of it reminded the villagers of one thing: they were not alone in this struggle. Back home, food was sorted by urgency. Apples were eaten early. They didn't last. Onions and garlic hung in braids from ceiling beams. Beans and lentils were stored in sacks. Cabbages were buried in sand to keep them cool and moist. If it could be preserved, it was. If it couldn't, it was consumed quickly, shared, or traded. Nothing wasted, nothing taken for granted. And still, even with full cellars and solid walls, the fear lingered, because autumn was when memory returned. Everyone remembered someone who didn't survive the last winter. A cousin who froze to death during a hunting trip. A neighbor who starved quietly. A baby who didn't wake up one morning, swaddled, but still blue. These were not abstract tragedies. They were fresh wounds in a community held together by calluses and stubbornness. Even religion felt different. In autumn, the church bells rang heavier, the prayers longer. People gave more to the poor, not out of charity, but out of insurance. Help the widow today, they'd say, and maybe someone helps you tomorrow. It wasn't saintly, it was strategy. And then came All Hallows' Eve, the final night of October, the turning point, when the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin, and the village held its collective breath. Candles were lit, doors stayed closed, food was left out for wandering spirits. Whether you believed or not didn't matter. You didn't take chances. For the peasant, life wasn't just a physical war against the elements. It was a spiritual tug-of-war against the unknown. Ghosts, demons, Witches. They were not entertainment. They were cautionary tales, boundary markers, ways to explain the inexplicable. And autumn, with its dying light and lengthening shadows, was when these beliefs took root like ivy around the soul. But even then, even in the face of ancient fear and fading warmth, there was defiance. The hearths were lit, the doors bolted, the children fed, the final apples baked into tarts, the last squash roasted over fire. The villagers didn't expect comfort, they expected endurance, and they prepared for it with the same quiet resolve they brought to every other season, because the truth was simple. If you'd made it this far, through the planting, the sweating, the harvesting, the culling, then you had earned the right to fight winter, even if you didn't win. And so, with the first frost shimmering on the grass, the village exhaled, tightened its belt, and waited. Not for rescue, not for mercy, just for the next battle. Summer was the season of hope, but it was also the season of reckoning. It began with the hum of insects and the shimmer of heat rising off the soil. The days grew long, sometimes unbearably so. The same sun that once felt like salvation now bore down with an almost vengeful intensity. Shade became treasure, water a bargaining chip. And yet, no one complained. They couldn't afford to, because summer was not a time to rest. It was the most critical, most back-breaking time of the year. It was harvest season. Everything the villagers had gambled on in spring, their seeds, their sweat, their fragile trust in the sky, was now on the line. The fields stood tall with wheat, barley, oats. Vegetables bloomed low to the ground. Fruit trees bore their weight in silence. But none of it meant anything until it was safely gathered, dried, and stored. A thunderstorm, a swarm of insects, a sudden rot. These could turn abundance into famine overnight. And so they worked, dawn to dusk. Children carried water buckets. Women harvested herbs and plucked beans. Men swung scythes in great arcs, shoulders aching, legs caked in sweat and dust. Meals were eaten standing. Conversations were brief. Even laughter, when it came, was clipped. Less joy, more release. The air buzzed with tension, but also purpose, because every bundle of grain brought in from the field was another chance to survive the coming winter. No one worked alone. A harvest was communal. Neighbors helped neighbors, not out of charity, but out of necessity. When one man's field was cleared, he joined another's. If your oxen failed, someone lent you theirs, because if one family starved, it weakened the whole village. Survival was shared, so was loss. There were moments of beauty too, moments that slipped in like sunlight through a cracked wall. A child chasing a grasshopper, the way golden wheat waved in the wind like a sea, a stolen kiss behind a haystack. These were not luxuries. They were survival of a different kind, a reminder that life, for all its weight, could still lift. But the threat of failure loomed. A hot, dry summer could parch the soil. Rivers shrank, wells dried. Thirst became a slow-burning ache that no amount of effort could fix. The sky, once watched for warmth, was now studied for clouds. Everyone scanned the horizon like nervous gamblers, hoping for rain, not a storm, just enough to keep the roots alive. And when the rains did come, they could come wrong, too late, too hard. Crops could drown just as easily as they could wither. The irony was cruel. The land that gave life had no obligation to sustain it. The earth didn't care. The seasons didn't bargain. Nature was not an enemy, but it was never a friend. In good years, the village celebrated. After the grain was cut and stored, after the fruits were picked and the root cellars were full, there would be a harvest feast. Bread, beer, stews rich with vegetables, and precious meat. There might be dancing, music, even laughter that didn't end in coughing. It was a rare exhale, a brief, precious illusion of plenty. But even then, no one forgot the truth. One good harvest did not guarantee another. The stores might last through winter. They might not. The granary might feed the village, or be emptied by rats, mold, or raiders. There was no such thing as certainty, only vigilance. Still, there was pride. Pride in the calloused hands, the aching backs, the shared toil. Pride in the fact that despite the odds, despite the unfairness of it all, they had taken the land and made it yield. They had bent the wild world to human need, just for a season, and perhaps that's what separated them from the world they battled. Not mastery, but refusal to surrender. The nobleman might boast of bloodlines. The priest might speak of divine favor. But the peasant? The peasant had the harvest, and that meant something. It meant they endured. Of course, not everyone survived the summer. Accidents happened. Tools slipped. Fevers took root in the heat. A deep cut from a sickle could turn to infection within days. There were no antiseptics, no doctors, only herbalists and prayers. When someone fell ill, it was a race between the body's strength and the earth's will. Sometimes the earth won, and yet life went on. It had to. Fields don't wait for grief. Animals still needed tending. Bread still had to be baked. A funeral might be held, a cross raised, but the scythe would still swing the next morning, because death, like drought, was part of the cycle, and the cycle did not pause. By late summer, the landscape changed. The fields were stubbled and bare. The trees grew heavy with early autumn fruit. The air cooled slightly, not enough to bring dread, but enough to stir memory. Winter was coming, not tomorrow, not next week, but soon enough to make you glance at the sky with old caution. The granaries were full, hopefully. The meat was salted, ideally. The thatch was repaired, the firewood chopped, the tools cleaned. Everything had to be in order, because if winter was a war, then summer was the armory. You didn't just work the land, you armed yourself with it. And still, somewhere in the middle of all this, between the sweat and the bruises, the heat and the hunger, something survived. Not just people, but hope. Not the romantic kind, not the soft kind, but the kind forged in blisters and broken fingernails, the kind that understood hardship was inevitable, but despair was optional. That was the genius of the medieval peasant, not just that they endured, but that they found meaning in the fight itself. Summer might have tested their limits, But it also proved their strength, because in the end, they knew a secret the world keeps forgetting. Survival is its own kind of victory. Spring didn't arrive with fanfare. It didn't burst in on a beam of sunlight with birdsong and flowers like some fairy tale. No, spring crept. It teased. A slightly softer wind one morning, a patch of earth peeking through the snow near the south-facing wall, a bird's distant call that wasn't there the day before. Hope returned not all at once, but in pieces. For the medieval peasant, spring wasn't a symbol, it was a deadline. If you survived the winter, you didn't celebrate. You got to work. The food stores were nearly gone. What little grain was left had to be stretched until the new crops came in. If you ate too much now, you might starve later. Hunger didn't disappear with the snow. In fact, late winter and early spring, called the hunger gap, were often worse than midwinter. Because now people were weak. Supplies were depleted. And yet, the hardest labor of the year was just beginning. The thaw revealed more than just soil. It revealed the damage. Roofs sagged from snow weight. Fences had collapsed. Tools rusted from damp. Some livestock hadn't made it. And sometimes, someone from the village hadn't made it either. Word would quietly spread of who didn't. Answer the door come spring. No mourning parties, no black veils, just a silent, shared glance between neighbors and a space left at the table. But there was no time to dwell. The land had to be prepared. Tools were sharpened, oxen yoked, and fields plowed with aching hands. Mud clung to everything. Your boots, your cart, your soul. It was cold, wet, exhausting work, but it was also life-giving. Every seed planted was a defiance, a declaration. I'm still here. The people moved with purpose, not joy. There was satisfaction, yes, but no illusion. A failed crop could still mean death. And the land, though thawed, remained unpredictable. A late frost, a storm, a rot. These could undo months of labor in a single night. So they worked cautiously, patiently, always listening to the signs around them. The smell of the earth, the movement of birds, the shape of the clouds. Nature didn't speak in words, but those who paid attention could hear her just the same. Even so, the mood shifted. Where winter was silence and survival, spring was motion and tension. Children who had been cloistered indoors emerged pale and wide-eyed, chasing chickens and climbing muddy fences. Women aired out garments stiff with smoke. Men repaired tools and bartered favors, sharpening someone's scythe in exchange for help digging a ditch. Villages stirred like bears rising from hibernation, hungry, grumpy, and in need of warmth. And warmth did return, slowly. Days lengthened. The sun held, just a little longer in the sky. It didn't yet kiss your skin, but it no longer felt like an enemy either. The scent of green returned, faint at first, like a memory, then stronger, like a promise. Life, against all odds, resumed, but survival left scars. You could see it in the older folk, wrinkled not just by time, but by cold and hunger, and the relentless push of years. You could see it in the wary eyes of the young, who had heard coughs in the night and whispers about missing neighbors. You could see it in the way no food was wasted. Not a crust of bread, not a spoonful of broth. Everything was precious, because everything had cost something. Spring wasn't a reward, it was a reprieve, a moment to gather strength before the next hardship came. Because in the medieval world, peace was never permanent. War, famine, plague, drought. These were not rare visitors. They were familiar guests. The people didn't romanticize hardship. They simply accepted it, endured it, and kept moving. And perhaps that was their greatest ingenuity. Not the clever tricks for staying warm, not the knowledge passed from parent to child, but the sheer will to persist. They didn't have safety nets. They didn't have backup plans. What they had was grit, community, the knowledge that if you fall, someone might help you up, but also that you were expected to stand on your own whenever possible. The eternal. War against cold was only one battle. There would be others. The seasons turned, as they always did, but those who had seen the snow melt and felt the sun return had won something, not just survival, but a deeper understanding of life itself, that it is fragile, that it is fleeting, and that it is still, somehow, worth the struggle. So they tilled the fields, mended their homes, and prepared once again to wrest life from a world that never promised it freely. Not with despair, not with bitterness, but with the quiet, ancient courage of people who knew no other way. But the battle against winter wasn't won indoors alone. No matter how well a family prepared their home, the cold didn't stay politely outside. It seeped in through the gaps in wooden walls, it rode the wind down the chimney, and it lingered, like a ghost. And eventually, someone had to go out and face it. Water had to be fetched, firewood chopped, animals fed, and fields checked, even if those fields were little more than frost-bitten wastelands for months at a time. The outdoors, in winter, was no playground. It was an unforgiving landscape where the very air could kill you if you stayed too long. There were no down jackets or thermal gloves. You had layers of rough wool if you were lucky, and some kind of hide or patched leather if you were very lucky. Scarves weren't fashion statements. They were battlefield gear. Feet wrapped in worn cloth trudged through snow that reached up to the knees, sometimes higher. And you didn't walk slowly. You moved with urgency. In the cold, every second counted. Tasks that were ordinary in summer became feats of endurance in the dead of winter. Carrying buckets of water from a frozen stream meant breaking through ice thick as a soldier's shield. Gathering firewood was a race against numb fingers, and feeding the animals, housed in barns that were barely warmer than the outside world, meant dealing with frostbitten rope, frozen troughs, and livestock just as miserable as their owners. And yet, no one thought it was heroic. It was simply life. You did what had to be done. If your fingers burned from the cold, you didn't complain. You rubbed them hard and got back to work. If a blizzard rolled in while you were out in the forest gathering wood, you didn't panic. You trusted your knowledge of the land. You found shelter. You waited it out. Fear was real, but it didn't rule them. Habit did. Nature, after all, wasn't just an enemy in winter. It was also an ally, if you knew how to listen. Trees spoke, not in words, of course, but in signs. how the bark felt under your hand, how the snow settled on their limbs, how the wind moved through their branches. The forest wasn't just a place to gather fuel, it was a teacher, and the peasant learned its lessons young. Where others might see only danger, they saw patterns, tracks in the snow, signs of movement, signs of weather. They could read the land the way a modern man reads a map, and in those frozen months, time stretched, days blurred together under the same iron-grey sky. There were no clocks on the walls, no morning shows, no calendars filled with plans. There was sunrise, work, a pause for food, more work, sunset, and then long, dark hours by the hearth. Nights were especially cruel. The cold deepened, silent and oppressive. But those nights also brought a strange kind of intimacy. The family huddled close. Stories were told. Not the kind found in polished books, but tales passed from grandmother to grandchild, legends half believed and fully loved. Songs were sung to push back the silence, and sometimes, on the rarest of nights, there was laughter. Because even in the hardest of winters, the human spirit searched for warmth, and sometimes found it not in fire, but in company. But let's not romanticize it too much. Winter was still a killer. It took the young, it took the old, it took the careless. A single mistake, leaving the fire untended, staying too long outside, falling ill with no remedy, could mean the end. Death didn't always come with drama. Sometimes it came quietly, a man lying down to rest and never waking up. Sometimes it came in the eyes of a mother, watching her child shiver with fever, knowing there was nothing more she could do. Yet despite all this, life continued, because it had to. Spring would come, eventually, and those who endured winter would be the ones to greet it. That was the unspoken promise beneath the snow, that the earth, though cold and cruel, would bloom again. And when it did, it was all the more beautiful for what had been endured. Surviving a medieval winter was not a triumph of technology. It was a triumph of knowledge, toughness, and community. The people who made it through were not weak, not passive, not ignorant. They were warriors of a quieter kind, who fought their battles not with swords, but with grit, shared wisdom, and an instinct for survival honed over generations. Their world was one where comfort was rare, but courage was common. They weren't trying to conquer the cold. They were learning to live with it, to bend with it, to outwit it. It was less a war and more a dance, dangerous, constant, and never quite won. But they danced it anyway. Winter didn't knock politely in medieval Europe. It crashed through the wooden shutters, howled down the thatched roofs, and made itself at home in the bones of every man, woman, and child. And while modern folk curse the cold from beneath, fleece blankets beside electric heaters, the medieval peasant had no such luxury. Their winters were not an inconvenience. They were a siege, an annual assault from nature itself. And year after year, without electricity, radiators, or even proper windows, peasants stared the cold in the face and found a way to survive. But survival didn't come from brute strength alone. It came from wisdom. Not the kind taught in schools or written in dusty books, but the kind whispered across generations, born from centuries of trial, error, and sheer stubborn refusal to die. They didn't have thermometers, but they knew when the air bit in a certain way, it was time to prepare. Their bodies became barometers, their habits sharpened by experience, and their ingenuity, their single greatest defense, became tradition. Medieval peasant homes were marvels of necessity, often damp, poorly lit, and barely sealed from the outside world. These crude shelters were anything but cozy, yet through clever adaptation, they were transformed into surprising sanctuaries. Every surface had a purpose. Every decision, from how the walls were packed to where the fire was placed, came from generations of accumulated knowledge. The goal wasn't comfort, it was survival, and they achieved it through a quiet, persistent kind of brilliance. There were no thermal windows or synthetic insulation, but there was an intimate understanding of how to trap warmth. Heat was not wasted. It was hoarded, protected like treasure. The hearth was the heart of the home, sometimes never allowed to go completely out, even overnight. Children learned early that feeding the fire wasn't just a chore, it was a lifeline. Ember preservation became an art, with families finding ways to keep a small glow alive beneath layers of ash until it could be coaxed back to life the next morning. This wasn't a matter of comfort. It was the line between warmth and frostbite. Even the way people slept was tactical. Families didn't tuck into separate rooms and beds. They layered themselves like living blankets, huddling close, maximizing body heat, and turning slumber into an act of solidarity. Privacy was a luxury no one could afford, not when frost crept across walls and every breath in the dark felt like smoke. The warmth of another human body was the difference between waking up sore or not waking up at all. Peasants also became masters of repurposing. Nothing was wasted. What today would be considered filth or trash was then a valuable resource. If it could hold warmth, block a draft, or insulate a wall, it was kept. The ingenuity of the time wasn't flashy. It was invisible, woven into daily life. You wouldn't walk into a peasant's cottage and be impressed by luxury. But if you looked closely, you'd see tiny acts of genius in every corner. The draft was blocked, not with cloth from a store, but with whatever was on hand. Windows weren't sealed with glass, but with common sense. And let's talk food. Because in winter, food wasn't just sustenance, it was internal fuel. Hearty stews, thick porridge, and anything that could be fermented, salted, or smoked filled the cooking pots. These meals weren't made to be fancy. They were made to keep the cold at bay. The goal wasn't taste, it was calories. Warm bellies meant warm bodies. Everything that could be stored for winter was. The harvest wasn't just celebrated, it was feared, because whatever wasn't preserved by the time the frost came would mean tighter rations and hungrier mouths. Water froze, toes went numb, noses dripped. But still, peasants endured. They kept animals inside with them, not just for protection from theft, but because those animals radiated heat. It was less home and more barn with aspirations. And yet, it worked. The animal smell may have been thick, but so was the warmth. Chickens in the corner, pigs near the door. Every breath in that room added to the body heat. It was survival in the shape of a barnyard. And yet, perhaps most remarkable of all was the attitude. There was no romanticism about winter, no talk of cozy season or snow days. Winter was a fight. It was grim and long and merciless. But peasants didn't sit and mope. They worked with what they had. When the first snow fell, no one panicked. They'd been preparing since autumn, storing, patching, sealing, planning. Winter didn't sneak up on them. It was an old enemy, expected and respected, and still, they didn't just survive the cold, they beat it, not with machines or technology, but with raw knowledge and sheer will. Every winter was a testament to the unspoken intelligence of those who had no other choice. They had no degrees, no blueprints, no fancy manuals, but they had each other, tradition, and the kind of cleverness that comes not from comfort, but from necessity. We might laugh today, sitting in our heated homes and double-glazed offices, but if the grid ever went down, it's not the modern man who would thrive. It's the one who remembers the old ways, the way peasants did. So when you imagine the medieval world, don't just see mud and misery. See quiet genius. See resilience wrapped in rags. See a people who stared down winter year after year and said, "Not today."